exceeding 80% of its existing supply by 2031, 2035 in that time frame. And Pittsburgh and Chatham County have similar time period projections. So it is critical for the water supply of this region to get this intake and the infrastructure involved with it in the ground as soon as possible to avoid any kind of disruptions. All right, so I showed you a picture kind of looking out from the shore of where the intake might be. This gives you a better idea. So there's an inset map on the bottom left that gives a broader idea of where this intake would be in Jordan Lake as a whole. On the left-hand side, you can see it's sort of zoomed in. Where that star is roughly where the tower intake would be, right off the shore of Vista Point State Park. The right-hand side shows where the pump station would be and where that tower would be out in the water. It's important to note, so there's a squiggly line there where the tower, I'm not sure if you can see it in yours or not, but one of the purposes of the project is to put this intake in as deep of water as possible. And so that is where the old New Hope Creek thalweg was. And so that's where the Western Intake Partnership has proposed to put this intake. It gets about, by putting it in the thalweg, it's about 10 to 15 feet lower than putting it outside that. And since it curves so close to the shore, it's convenient. OWASA purchased this property where the pump station would be back in the early 90s, I believe it was. So that property was available. The proposal is to have a directional bore all the way from the pump station to the intake. So there would be no physical structures on the land at all, because all of it would be in that tower. Any questions on that? All right. Just for perspective as to what the tower might look like, this is on the right-hand side. This is a picture of Raleigh's tower intake in Falls Lake. The Jordan Lake one, as you can see with the numbers here, would be a little bit higher. I'm noticing particularly the height above normal pool in Falls is around 13.5 feet. And with this project, it would be approximately 24 feet. But otherwise, it would look very similar. So, before the Corps wants to entertain applications on this project and really move this forward, we were directed that all the state agencies involved, all the managing partners need to be in concert with each other. Makes a lot of sense since we are acting as the state. So we worked significantly with NC Parks, state parks, on what it would mean for them to put this project on the shore from the state park. And effectively what it means is the park will be closed for approximately 3 years during construction. The Western Intake Partnership is committed to a number of things, avoiding impacts and minimizing impacts where avoidance just isn't possible. It is interesting to note the tower intake was preferred over a submerged intake, which submerged intake you wouldn't be able to see out in the lake, but there would be a structure on the land itself to change where the gates for the intake would be. And the parks parks understandably were hesitant on supporting another structure and then access to that structure on state park land that they manage. I mentioned the directional bore, so there'll be no open cut in this project for this part of it, the intake to the pump station. And then coordination with NC Parks will be carried on throughout the project into the major and even minor stuff, fencing, tree removal, how the docks will look, how just there'll be a lot of issues over those 3 years, I suspect. And the WIP has committed to mitigating for the 36 months of closure and return the park back to in-kind or better condition. Yeah.
Did you say that the EIS or EA has been done for this, or is it in process?
The EA is in process. So the state is acting as the applicant because we signed the water supply agreement with the Corps of Engineers. And so internally, we had comments on that EA and the application. And those have been largely integrated. I think I spoke to the consultant a couple of days ago, and he said it'd be another week or two, they'd have it finalized likely to then be able to submit it to the Corps.
So you're not concerned at all about other groups coming in other than parks, talking about the park being down for 3 years and the mitigation and all that kind of stuff related to that? Because again, you're assuming one location here and not looking at alternatives, I assume. So are you worried about somebody coming in and saying this isn't acceptable?
We did have conversations with WRC as to what that might mean for them from a greater usership to their boat ramps since it will be closed.
Yeah.
Exactly what that looks like, we didn't seem to have a clear view on what that usership might look on each particular boat ramp, but that the WIP and WRC are in communication, and there has been some talk of upgrading a couple other boat ramps to be able to handle some heavier traffic, but nothing terribly specific.
Yes, Commissioner DeGreg.
So I understand what you're asking about there. He said he talked to WRC, but you didn't answer his question about state parks, DNCR.
Well, we've talked to state parks as well about their use of their other parks and how their other parks may be impacted by this closure.
Well, I'm going to back up just a second. Could we go back to the map? I want to make sure I have my bearings right. Okay, so going left to right, I'm headed toward Pittsburgh, right? Vista Point is off.
Yes.
Pittsburgh is to the
left.
To the left.
Oh, okay.
So to the west.
Okay, this is north-south. Okay. All right.
Yeah, you can see Vista Point. It's very popular. I mean, that's where all the boats and
but there's also a beach on the other side that I'm trying to, I guess that was the one I was thinking was called Vista Point. Well, okay, thanks. That helps to know that. Then what about the safety and security of having a tower that close to a public access beach?
So it's a great point. It has to be, it meets, the public water supply section does have rules on how close a project can be to a swim beach. And it's outside of that, distance. I try to remember the distance off the top of my head, but it is outside that distance. Wildlife Resources Commission had concerns about boater safety, significant concerns about boater safety that they felt could be mitigated with lights, signs, deterrents.
There are just a number of issues of having it that close to a public area, but also the 3-year closure. I mean, there are a lot of families that depend on that probably as their only recreational source. Did you say that there are alternatives?
So there are alternative state parks as well as WRC ramps around.
No, alternatives for the tower.
Oh, alternatives for the tower. So they looked at a few alternative locations. We looked at a few alternative locations kind of on that, right there on that western side. Most of them would still impact Vista Point, or there would be an exceptionally long distance for the directional bore that may not even be able to do a directional bore for the distance. So if we looked at going north of that, where that star is, you end up with shallower water because you're moving away from that thaw leg, and much longer distance to the pump stations,
May I just ask one more question?
Yes, and then Commissioner Gibson has some questions.
Forgive me for not understanding the engineering of a tower, but is there any turbulence created with the intake pumps? Any disturbance of sediment or the water column or?
I'm probably not the best person to get into the details of the turbulence, but it's my understanding that it's effectively the same type of turbulence as what would be with a submerged intake.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry.
No, thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's been other alternatives considered other than expanding supply, like incentives to decrease water use, promote conservation in the planning, or is it all about supply expansion?
Durham does have a significant conservation program. And they're right now they'd be the primary user of the project. And certainly OWASA has a robust conservation program that's very effective. They recently did looked at their two water supplies, Lake Mickey and Little River Reservoir, their two major water supplies, and found that the safe yields, because of some sedimentation issues, weren't quite what they had been planning, what they had long planned. So this project really becomes even perhaps more important to make up for some of what on paper was sort of lost in their safe yields.
Yes, Commissioner Tweedy.
So the entire shaded area up there on the map on the left shown as Vista Point, would that, all that light green shaded, would that be closed? Is that what our understanding?
Yeah, yes. So that whole on the right-hand side, that shaded area, really, because there's one way in and one way out, and most of the traffic is geared towards going to that boat ramp. Now, they do have camping facilities out there, but really because there's one way in and one way out, with the construction going back and forth, it'd be a safety issue to start to have folks using that, as well as having big trucks pulling equipment in and out, and without use of the boat ramp either.
Yeah, I understand. It just seems like a large area to close, but I understand the logistics of that if there's only one exit.
And there will certainly be signage at that gate, and if they're certainly on, there was talk of on busier weekends or what have you, there'd be somebody out there directing people as to where else they can go to use facilities at Jordan Lake during this time.
Yes, Commissioner Doug.
Excuse me, from the pump station, where do the lines run?
So from the pump station, you'll see, so it looks like there's 3 or even 4 sort of properties that are noted on there. The biggest one is primarily going to be where that water treatment plant is going to be. And then from there, the water treatment plant will have trunk lines that run up, I think that's still Big Woods Road there. You can see it kind of curving in. And that will run up north, primarily along Big Woods Road all the way to Durham. And they have an existing pump station. I can't remember the name of the road, but they have an existing pump station they can tie into.
And may I ask, is there any, I know that there's a one way in, one way out. Was there any thought given to a temporary access at some other point?
There was a little bit of talk of that, if that was even a possibility, and it's the way it's built. There really isn't a good possibility to do that, and then it would really only be using the camping areas that yeah, to really use those camping areas. The camping areas are kind of they're just north of, you see the road on the right-hand side, that map, just north of where that road comes in, sort of right near where the pump station line crosses. That's where those camping areas are. It would also create another access point that, even though once this project is closed, you could close that access. State Parks is particularly sensitive to additional access points. It was their concern with having a submerged intake, where there'd be an access point to the peninsula, a road that people would use, and would be more management for them to have to handle people having access to areas that, I mean, there are trails that go out there, but there's not roads. And I think that would be another concern for the parks to even have a temporary access, really just for the camping, because the ramp is going to be used for construction, the ramp area.
Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner Smith.
Where in relation to this proposed intake is the existing intake?
Yeah, so look on the map on the left-hand side, and you'll see 64. And Cary's intake is right on, so go to 64, and on the eastern side of Jordan, right near where it begins to cross Jordan Lake is right. It's approximately where Cary's intake is. So it's not very far. But its intake is in shallower water than what this is proposed to go to.
One follow-up question. So has the entire Jordan Lake Reservoir been designated as water supply?
It is.
Thank you.
It is. Thank you.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
The question was whether the entire Jordan Lake has been designated as water supply, which would mean the water supply watershed rules apply to the entire periphery of the lake already.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the questions, everyone. So wrapping it up, I mentioned working with WRC, also work with Forest Service, their landholders, land managers out there at Jordan Lake. There's been lots of coordination with other agencies, both state and federal agencies, to include DWR with our Section 401, sorry. Program. Also, the State Historic Preservation Office has been engaged. There have been no objections to the proposed project that we're aware of. And on the right-hand side is just another looking out, sort of a different angle, looking out towards where that tower would be off the shore.
Yes, Commissioner Tweedy.
So how does this additional allocation to the western part of the reservoir, how does that affect the overall allocation that's available? So west of Jordan Lake is developing rapidly, so is the eastern side. So how is there, two-part question maybe, how is that, how much of that allocation is now being used? And is there a long-term planning process for Jordan Lake and how that allocation is going to be used for the next 50 years plus or something like that?
Right. Thank you. Yeah. So right now, following the 2017 round 4 allocations, it has been allocated to 91.2 MGD. It's we take 100 MGD is effectively the safe yield of that. That's how we've been operating for a long time, and it's a percentage of the total acre feet for that water supply pool. Got some new WebEx stuff here. Oh. Okay, so it's already been allocated. And the city of Durham was allocated 16.5. Like other projects, we look out 30 years of planning. So you can think of, this was done in, was looking at 2015 data. So if we go out 30 years from that, we're looking out to 2045 approximately with these allocations. So that's the long-term planning. There's still an 8.8 percentage that's remaining for future allocation, round 5 allocations, which we haven't had any request or any contemplation on having a round 5, but there's still a little bit left for that time.
So without diving too deep into the
Sure.
numbers, there's no concerns that have been identified about the available water supply for the surrounding area for Jordan Lake in the foreseeable planning.
So the water supply was kind of, that's why that graphic shows it's really set aside for water supply. And the Corps of Engineers, and it is an accounting effort because it's all, only have so many gates and they all lift out of the same pool of water. But that flow augmentation, the water quality pool, that's twice the size of the water supply pool, that's for minimum releases out of the project. But the 100 MGD, that was determined during planning construction of the project to be sustainable withdrawals and still maintain minimum releases.
No, I was just gonna say perspective on 2017, and there's some actual users in the room that went through that, but it's a laborious process when you go through this. And the commission has to see all the planning numbers and make the final decisions. I don't think we changed much from round 3 to round 4. We added to it, but we're at the end now. So if we go to round 5, to maybe more directly answer your question, we'd have to look at everybody's planning numbers and figure out what to do with the rest of it, or does somebody need all of it? And that would be the sticky part for us, for this committee, to come up with what was the fair balance going forward.
What would round 5, is that to be determined?
To be determined.
To be determined when it's requested and generally agreed upon that it's time to initiate a round 5. So it would come from perhaps the department, but also the commission.
All right, seeing no further questions at this time, I think we can move to your second presentation, Mr.
Okay.
Brady. And that will be about we'll get an IBT update.
Okay. I'll try to go through this one quick. There's not a whole lot of new information from the IBT update that occurred back in May. But we still have 2 interbasin transfer requests that are going through the process. The first one I'll talk about is Charlotte Water. They're requesting in the 60 range, 60 MGD range. They have an existing certificate of 33 MGD. They're proposing to move water from the Catawba River Basin to the Rocky River Basin. And you can see in this map, their service area is Mecklenburg County, and the Rocky Basin cuts right, the basin boundary for the Rocky cuts right down the center, right down the middle of the county. This is to signify, so this is a process slide, and they are very much still in the first step of the process. So the public meetings associated with their notice of intent. I stole this slide from Charlotte Water. This is their modification schedule. And you can see right now we're at the very beginnings, and well, I guess we're a little bit past the spring 24, but we're coming up on fall 24 here, where they planned on having stakeholder engagement workshops. They've been working with the Catawba Water Management Group, as well as the Yadkin PD Water Management Group on establishing these work groups, which I think is very, I think it's a great idea and should be very productive. Note the star down below, the coordination with South Carolina DES throughout this. they're certainly committing to coordinate with South Carolina. There are two more meetings left. Only one of those is noted here. It's sort of hot off the presses from yesterday. I can give you the notice here. I've got a few copies. But anyway, next Monday, the 15th, is that next Monday? Yeah. In Morganton, there will be a public meeting. The public meeting in Hickory was well attended, I will say that. And because it was so well attended, there was a real need to have another meeting in that area to make sure that everybody's voice, comments are taken into consideration and they have ample opportunity to voice any concerns or issues with this proposed project. The other meeting, meeting 7, is, I want to make sure I get it right. It will be in Rock Hill, South Carolina, on July 29th at the Dutchman Creek Middle School. The notice has been sent out, updated public notice has actually already been published in the clearinghouse, and it has been noticed in newspapers and around. Those are the two meetings. Here are the web pages, both Charlotte Water's webpage as well as DEQ's webpage on the subject. The second, before I move on, does anybody have any questions on the Charlotte Water transfer?
Commissioner Deerhag.
How was attendance at the other meetings, for example, Albemarle?
Albemarle and Charlotte, they were good. They were well attended. It was more typical of what we see. So between a dozen to 24 people at those public hearings. The meeting in Hickory was the room held, when I understand, 220, and it was maxed out. It was full.
So Albemarle's in the Yadkin, right?
Right. Right. The Albemarle meeting was intended to be the receiving basin.
Okay.
Yes, Commissioner Smith.
Can you remind us what federal approvals would be necessary?
For Charlotte Waters, I don't believe they have. I mean, they already have their FERC permit for withdrawals out of Norman, and they're allowed to withdraw. I believe the number is 330 MGD out of Norman and Mountain Island Lake. I should add both of them together. And that was the federal FERC permit that allowed for the withdrawals. The federal government doesn't typically speak on IBT, interbasin transfers. So aside from the existing FERC permit, and there's no additional infrastructure like a section.
Section 10.
Yeah, it's already been handled for the large part.
So there's no modification of the FERC approval necessary to increase the amount of the withdrawal?
That's correct.
And no new infrastructure?
That's correct. Yeah, the intakes can handle this additional and any additional water that's withdrawn to handle the service area is growing, and so that's what's happening with the transfer, just needing to move more water through that.
Other questions on Charlotte?
Okay, so quickly on to Fuquay Arena. We're still working through the EIS process. They've proposed approximately 6 MGD moving from the Cape Fear to the Noose, from the Sanford water treatment plant to Fuquay Arena's Terrible Creek wastewater treatment plant. And this signifies, it's intended to show, this is the process they're following. This is the full-blown IBT process, not a modification process, is what Charlotte Water is looking at. This is a new certificate process, and they are in the second step, working through establishing that environmental document to go out to the public and have a public hearing on that.
Got to ask you, you know it will. If I may, So when did Fuquay start their process and how many years has that been working in the current phase?
So they started their process and I believe we had our first meeting in, let's see, February 2020. The NOI came out in late August or early September of 2020. We had those public hearings in October, may have spilled into November. I think it was all October. And then after that, they began working on writing the EIS. So we've been in that process since that time.
And again, if I may, Madam Chair, the concern I would have is purpose and need changing
Okay,
in the 4-year period. Do we have the right numbers and
right.
verify? I mean, it could go up, they could go down, right? But we don't want to get caught in our tracks because that's what we decided 4 years ago and we don't update it. So I just make that comment that I'd be concerned as the clock keeps ticking that it's evolving on us pretty fast.
Right, and that comment is well taken. Thank you, JD.
Oh, yes.
It,
Commissioner
it
Smith.
appears that Commissioner Lyerly's hand is up on the screen. I don't know if that's a new hand or if it's been there for a while.
That's a mute.
That's a cursor.
Okay. Well, Commissioner Weiss, a question, or Chairman Weiss, Chairwoman Weiss. Harold, not to give away intentions, but we talked about another IBT that may have been noticed in early July because I had concerns with the change at South Carolina, that they were changing their department structures, right? When that notice would come out.
Right.
Do you have any more information on a third IBT that may come in that you could share, or is it still being contemplated?
Well, I mean, since you brought it up, there's a potential for a third one, Mooresville, in the Catawba Basin, be similar Catawba to Rocky transfer. And that, from what I understanding now, is closer to the August, September timeframe before we would see an NOI.
So that was the point of the question. I didn't want us to come in September and something that broke on us the day after we met and this committee not be aware of it. So
Yeah, no, I
it may
appreciate that.
happen between now and the next meeting then.
It very well may happen. There will be another transfer. Exactly what those numbers look like, I don't know. I don't really know. I don't know the details on that, but it's very likely that another request would come in potentially before the next water allocation committee meeting.
Yes.
On the Fuquay Varina environmental impact, are they doing an EA or an EIS? It said or between the two. Where are they doing the EA right now?
The Fuquay Varina is doing an EIS.
EIS,
Yep.
okay.
Yep, there.
Are there any sensitive issues that are going to pop up? For example, ecological issues or any challenges that we should anticipate hearing about?
I suspect there will be challenges if it moves forward.
Environmental issues, not people challenging.
Not legal challenges,
No,
okay.
no. Any environmental issues.
I'm fascinated to really see the final results of seeing what the OASIS model shows, our OASIS hydrologic model, as to what sort of downstream impacts we will have to water supplies downstream. Right now, from what I've seen, is that all needs are met throughout the projections. So we're looking out both 30 and they took it out to 50 years, that all needs are met from downstream water suppliers. But the details of exactly what that means, those may be environmental issues, yes.
See no further questions. I will just thank you, Mr. Brady, for these presentations and information, and we'll
Good job.
Thank you.
look forward to seeing you at our next meeting.
All right, well, thank you so much for your time.
Okay. Our third agenda item, information item, is going to be an overview of South Carolina versus North Carolina 2010 settlement agreement. We have Mary Lucas from the Attorney General's office to give us a presentation.
It's good to be here. I was hired in 2009 to be the attorney handling the discovery and all the busyness of this case. Before that, I'd done litigation in Hawaii for 15 years, litigation with the Maryland Attorney General's office, and I was really hired to work on this case that we anticipated would be going on for 20, 30, 40 years, as many original jurisdiction concerns about water have gone on. I don't know if you guys follow this, but it's fascinating. So it didn't go on. It was settled pretty early, and I moved into working with commissions and other DEQ staff. But I'm here today to review what happened back then, which is some time ago. And I'm pleased to notice that Tom Franson, who was my colleague over at the department and was a staff member who worked very closely with me, is also here today. And he's indicated that he's willing to answer questions if you have any. So I wanted to orient you, and I know you know this very well, but this case, South Carolina sued North Carolina in the US Supreme Court because they were complaining about whether or not they had enough water in the Catawba River Basin. And that's where you see it. So often, as you all know, the geology, the water resources, they don't follow political lines. In this case, that was true. The river starts in North Carolina and it enters the sea in South Carolina. And so because we had come from a period of drought, South Carolina was very concerned about how much water it was being allocated in this river basin. So back in 2007, South Carolina petitioned the Supreme Court for permission to file the complaint. Most of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with the Supreme Court, which handles appeals. This is original jurisdiction. It's a case that begins in the US Supreme Court, and that's what happens when states have quarrels. Because South Carolina doesn't want to come to North Carolina and be home cooked. North Carolina doesn't want to go to South Carolina and have judges over there give their government whatever they want. Not that that would necessarily happen, but so that's why they can go to the US Supreme Court, who resolves things. The complaint was really about equitable apportionment of the Catawba River, and what South Carolina was looking for was a decree from the Supreme Court saying what each state could have. Whoops, too fast there. So let's go back here. The trigger, in my opinion, for bringing this case was not only the drought, but the fact that back in 2007, this committee had authorized an IBT that had been requested by the cities of Concord and Kannapolis. That IBT authorized the transfer of 10 million gallons a day from the Catawba River to the Rocky River. And as an aside, as you are very well aware, there was actually challenges to that IBT certificate that were filed in OAH. Different ones, they ended up being consolidated. And so that, and Jill, you probably know this very well, those petitions were finally settled outside the original litigation, and they were settled in May 2010. Initially in this case, North Carolina was the only defendant. South Carolina sued North Carolina. But Duke Energy, Carolinas, the Catawba River Water Supply Project, and the city of Charlotte moved to intervene. They wanted to have a seat in the table at the US Supreme Court. So the reason Duke wanted to come in is because they own and operate, as you all know, I'm sure, a system of 11 reservoirs in the Catawba River Basin. There are 6 in North Carolina, 4 in South Carolina, and 1 at Lake Wylie, which is on the border between the two states, all of which are subject to a 50-year license that's issued by the federal government. Used to be called the Federal Power Commission, but you now probably know it as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. So Duke moved to intervene because they impounded waters in their reservoir and they released the waters, and that played a substantial role in determining the flow of the river. Duke was allowed to intervene. And the reason really was nobody else had the same interest. Duke was the only person that had that interest, and the court wanted to give them a seat at the table. Now, the Catawba River Water Supply Project was an other intervener, and they requested the right to come in because they're a joint venture between units of the state government in South Carolina, as well as a unit of government in North Carolina, which is Union County. It's a very unusual joint venture. In fact, I'm not aware of any other in North Carolina, though there may be. I haven't done a search for that. But it holds, that river supply project holds an IBT authorizing the transfer of 36 million gallons a day, 5 for Union County. And it too was allowed to intervene because it had the same interests as both states. So it seemed that the court, and we were working with the special master, really wanted to hear its point of view. Now, Charlotte, who also moved to intervene, the largest municipality on the Catawba River, it held a permit authorizing the transfer of up to 33 million gallons a day from the river basin. However, its motion to intervene was denied. And the reason given is that because a state represents its citizens, Charlotte would be bound by whatever North Carolina was bound by. So Charlotte was allowed to participate as an amicus, which is a friend of the court, so it could file briefs, but it didn't have a party interest in this case because it was already represented by North Carolina. So what's interesting for me about that is because Charlotte was not part of this South Carolina versus North Carolina litigation. The settlement agreement that was eventually entered into by the parties does not bind Charlotte. Just as they were bound in the original jurisdiction by the state of North Carolina, here the state of North Carolina is bound by the settlement agreement, which we entered into, and you, as the representatives of the state here at the EMC, have to follow it. But you're the people that are bound, and you'll tell Charlotte what they need to do to be consistent with that. And that's my opinion on this. So moving on to the original jurisdiction case, we thought it would go on for a long, long time. It didn't. I was hired in 2009. It was settled in 2010. And that had a lot to do with politics, in my opinion. So having to do with different attorney generals who had wanted to move forward in South Carolina, lost an election, and then they decided to not leave this case around for their opponent to move forward with, perhaps in a way that they didn't approve of. And so what happened is that in August 2010, the Catawba Watery River Basin Advisory Commission, which is a bi-state commission advisory, it's not making rules, but it encouraged the parties. It took a very active role in asking the states to use the Comprehensive Relicensing Agreement, CRA, as a starting point for settlement discussions. So this is the license from FERC that deals with flows that Duke can release in the river basin, and staff at both in North Carolina, Tom Franson and his folks, and others at what's now known as DEQ and down in South Carolina began to talk about what that would mean to resolve this case. So the parties went back to the bi-state commission in November, and we said, look, we're thinking about this. This is what it would look like. What do you guys think? And they approved that concept, and so we moved forward in December and settled it. So what's important, I think, is to realize that a lot of work had already been done. Duke's FERC license had been set to expire in 2008. So they had engaged in, Duke that is, had engaged in a multi-year, multi-stakeholder process to develop the comprehensive relicensing agreement. And they had actually reached an agreement, and they had submitted that agreement as part of the relicensing application in the federal license. And so that agreement called for South Carolina to receive about 1,000 cubic feet of water a second at the state line. And when the litigation was filed, South Carolina was claiming that the flow of water was less than that. And that was both because of natural drought, which had really stressed the area leading up to this, as well as the IBTs. So what happened in the settlement agreement is that We have enforceable promises, and I'll go through that with you, but the settlement agreement did not apportion the river, and it did not enjoin future IBTs, which were the two things that South Carolina had filed the complaint to get. So in some ways, in my opinion, this kind of like fizzled. It didn't apportion the river. It didn't, say anything about IBTs, but rather the CRA, which was already in existence, became the foundation for the settlement. And in fact, as we'll see as we go through the existing regulations that this commission had set having to do with IBTs, in our legislature has also set for standards for IBTs and how you have to do that, became the guiding principle. And we had been encouraging South Carolina, who had very different regulations, to match what certainly on our side we thought was a better approach. And that's what this settlement agreement, in my opinion, was about. So the framework of the settlement agreement, I've already mentioned this. We work with the CRA, and that I believe is a 50-year license, so it goes through 58. The parties acknowledged existing IBTs, and if you're following along on the settlement agreement, which was attached to the agenda, this is basically what the settlement agreement says. This is where we're starting from. This is our framework. And then the parties recognized that there might be a need to adjust the low inflow protocol. So by the time we settled this case, the drought had it's not evaporated, but it had dissipated. And so water was not nearly as much a scarce commodity as it had been prior to this time. So there was a recognition that we might have to do with more with low inflow protocols, but it wasn't actually done. So I want to take a minute and go through what the promises in the settlement agreement are. And once again, if you're following along, it's really pretty much paragraph by paragraph. There was a recognition in the first paragraph that the laws and the regulations in North Carolina and South Carolina for water allocation and use are not the same. And it was certainly my impression from talking with staff at the Division of Water Resources in 2010 that in our staff's opinion, North Carolina had a better procedure, better regulations, better grasp of how to do these things. And the reason in part was that at that time, and I'm not talking about the present, I haven't kept up with this. I don't know where South Carolina is now. I know they were in the process of updating things. But in 2010, South Carolina did not have a State Environmental Protection Act. South Carolina did not request written findings of fact for permitting decisions. South Carolina's regulations were, in our staff's opinion, not as strong as those in North Carolina because the applicant did not have the burden of proving the need for an IBT, only providing a justification, which is actually subtle, but an important distinction. I want it. That can be a justification, but what's the need? And that's what we required here in North Carolina. In addition, South Carolina didn't have in 2010 reporting requirements for transfers, only for withdrawals. So that's the reason for the first paragraph, a recognition that we have different regulations in both states. The second paragraph of the settlement agreement was a forward-looking. We decided that it was really important that we keep up to date on water use. And so there's a commitment to doing a basin supply study every 10 years. As I understand it, the first update has been done. That was completed in 2018. Both states are committed to paying for that. North Carolina still has to write their check, but I believe it's in process. And the purpose is to assess consumptive water uses within the river basin. So you can't regulate something if you don't know what you have. And that, I think, was very much the case with South Carolina. They were feeling a need for water, but they really didn't know how it was being used, in our opinion. So this settlement agreement had a commitment to study it and see what we have. And so the third paragraph in the settlement agreement is an agreement between the states to coordinate and implement a consistent system of approving IBTs. And the reason for that is we all understand that you can't do a good job of of providing notice for an IBT if you don't give notice in South Carolina. And I was interested in Harold Brady's presentation to notice for the IBTs. There is notice happening and public hearings happening in South Carolina because we share this water. The river basin is shared. There's a commitment in the third paragraph to hold public meetings. And these are, if I recall correctly, and Tom can correct me if I'm wrong, we basically were including in the settlement agreement what North Carolina was already doing. So we wanted both states to commit to using the same rigor in doing IBTs. So you have to do notice, you have to do public meetings, you have to have findings of fact on the required necessity, reasonableness, impacts on the source, benefits on the receiving basin, and also include drought conditions. And then once again, the settlement agreement indicates that the applicant has the burden of proving justification. So when you move through the settlement agreement, which is actually a very, very short document, if you've ever seen lawyers write settlement agreements, you're probably surprised that we have only like 7 paragraphs of promises, and they're all pretty much aspirational and intentional, but they're not, they don't allocate the river, as you've seen. But what you have here in paragraph 5 is a promise to develop a memorandum of agreement. Not a time frame, just do it when it's reasonably practicable. And the purpose of that MOA was to coordinate permitting approval processes for bi-state water providers so that they didn't have to meet one requirement for this state and another requirement for that state. Now, as we know, the intervener the Catawba River Water Supply Project is probably the only person that this really applies to. And my recollection was that they wanted this because they didn't want to be having to do 2 systems. Now, what happened is that an MOA has not been finalized. And Tom and I and others worked on this for quite some time after the settlement agreement was signed and the case was dismissed in the Supreme Court. And the reason it didn't move forward, at least this is my recollection, is that South Carolina's regulations actually did not conform to the requirements in the settlement agreement. That was paragraph 3 that we had just been talking about. So until the states had the same procedures, DEQ staff and my office, Department of Justice, didn't see any point in completing an MOA because we couldn't have a coordinated process if we weren't asking for the same things. And we were already had a more onerous process, a more stringent process. So the bi-state water suppliers were already meeting what we required because they had to in order to get a permit from North Carolina. So we didn't lose anything by not moving forward with MOA. And to the extent that the bi-state water provider had some duplication, they have not complained in recent memory to me about this as well, or to anybody else that I'm aware of. So that is a piece of the settlement agreement that hasn't happened. Is it worth reopening the case, going back to the Supreme Court? I don't think anybody's ever considered that. That's a huge step to take. And one of the purposes in this litigation was to resolve things like neighbors, to start working together. And I believe that our agencies, our environmental agencies, have been working together. There are ongoing conversations. And as far as I know, we have not had onerous, uncoordinated permitting approval processes. So I think 6 is, the 6th paragraph is self-explanatory. The case was dismissed in the US Supreme Court, and that was a good thing. And then the 7th paragraph of the settlement agreement is simply an agreement that we're not going to sue for equitable apportionment because the allocation is tied to the terms of the FERC license. And so if there was any concerns, you go back to the CRA to resolve that, and there might be material changes. But you can file. Both states haven't given up their right to file, but only after making a good faith effort to address any concerns based on what's going on with FERC and the CRA with the other state. So that very simply put, is what the settlement agreement is. These are promises that North Carolina has made. They're promises that comport with the legislative requirements for IBTs and your commission's rules regarding IBTs. And so I don't think that this case or this settlement agreement should stop you from your path. It doesn't require Charlotte to do anything other than what you would be requiring it to do anyway, to be consistent with North Carolina's statutes and rules. So do you have any questions?
Before we take questions for Ms. Lucas, since we started late, I wanted to check with Chairman Solomon. We've gone for an hour. Do we have 5 minutes for questions?
Let's take a few minutes for questions and then we can move on because we need to get the Air Quality Committee going in about 10 minutes. So.
I understand. Thank you.
And
Thank you,
let me
Ms.
add
Lucas.
And let me just add overarching comment. It may help you with questions you can catch her afterwards. But
Absolutely.
one of the things that Chair Weiss and I saw coming was this one and maybe another one in Catawba Basin. Most of you don't know what this was, and you would hear it talked about, wouldn't know it. So we thought for an information item, it'd be good just to be aware of it. And it is in the IBT legislation that we will follow these interstate compacts and agreements. And so we didn't want any of y'all to say, what is that? And find yourself halfway through this process and not know what it was. So that was really introduction. And I think Mary and Tom have been through the battles here and they can answer any questions y'all have at the breaks or anywhere else.
And I'll certainly stay for the break, or you can reach me through Jill, through the North Carolina Department of Justice. I didn't bring cards, or through Ellie. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you again, Mary. Appreciate that presentation. Does anyone have a burning question that they can't hold until the break? Or a question, not a burning question. It was a lot of information. Yes. Commissioner Adair.
So the original request also included withdrawals from the Yadkin River, right? That was a two-part Concord-Kannapolis request was Catawba and Yadkin withdrawals.
And interestingly enough, I don't know a lot about the IBT from those two towns, because although that might have been the trigger for the South Carolina versus North Carolina state, that was handled separately within the Office of Administrative Hearings, and different attorneys from my office dealt with it, and that wasn't actually part of the original jurisdiction.
Where I was going with this was, it's my understanding that more has been withdrawn from the Yadkin than originally planned. I mean, it's still, I think, within the conditions of it, but more than planned originally, or that actually promised in terms of gearing up to take it out of the Yadkin. So I was just curious if removing more from the Yadkin has softened the impact of the current IBT.
I don't know the answer to that.
Catawba.
And I think any update to the study that was done in 2018 will provide that information in 2028. And staff, if you do get requests, will be talking with you, I'm sure, about water use and needs. And I don't know the answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you again. Very much appreciated. All right. I'm going to pivot to director's remarks.
No additional remarks except for thanks to staff for their work on the Western intake and the IPD processes. Certainly appreciate it.
And same for me with my closing remarks. And also thank you to members of the public for your patience with that hiccup this morning and starting late. So with that in mind, I think I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Okay. Meeting
We'll
adjourned.
bring the air quality, Chris, together in 5 minutes at 22. Okay?
Yep.